Hi, and welcome back to English Lessons with Stephanie. This is reading lesson number 3, Civil Disobedience. We'll be doing a close reading of the text that we used in the listening lesson from this week. In this lesson, we'll start with some pre-reading questions, then we'll do a guided reading. We'll read the story paragraph by paragraph. Within each paragraph, we're going to practice reading out loud by pausing the video, then listening. Again, we'll be using the GASP method of guessing, answering questions, summarizing, and predicting. The goal here is to get you reading quickly and easily. So let's start with some pre-reading. This week's reading is called Civil Disobedience. But what does civil disobedience mean? Well, we can start by looking at the word civil. You might recognize the word civil you might recognize that you can find the word civil in the noun civilization. Civilization refers to human progress of people living together. A city is considered a civilization. So civilization can be a thing, or it could be the idea of people living together and working together. And so civil is the adjective form of civilization. Here it can mean orderly, like organized, or related to civilization. Next, we have the word disobedience. And if you break down the word disobedience, you can see that obedience, so we take off the dis and we have obedience. And obedience is the noun form of obey. So obey means to follow a rule. For example, children should obey their parents, and we should obey the law. And obedience is the noun, following the law. So disobedience means not following the law. Basically, civil disobedience means not following the law in an orderly way. Or we could say orderly disorder. And when we think about the words civil disobedience, this is a common phrase. We often think about great leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. or Gandhi. These were people who worked for civil rights, for the rights of people, and they did it in a way that was orderly, but it was against the law. As you read, remember we're going to use the GASP method. If we encounter words or phrases that we don't understand, we will guess at the meanings for now. At the end of each paragraph, that's when we'll look back and see if we still have questions that we need to answer before we move forward. And at the end of each paragraph, we're going to summarize. That means we're going to say the main idea of the paragraph, and then we'll predict what we'll see in the next paragraph before we read it. The idea here is to not look at a dictionary too many times because that will just slow us down. It's important to learn how to guess at meanings that may not be perfect but are good enough. This will help us to read faster. So if you want to practice your reading, you should pause the video here and read out loud, and then unpause it and listen and read it again. This week, my teenage nephew got caught in a lie. He told his parents he was going out for a bike ride in their suburban neighborhood, but then he didn't return for hours. His parents tried calling him but got no answer, so they were worried sick about him. When he finally returned some 6 hours later, the truth came out. He'd ridden his bike to the nearest large city, almost 20 miles away, in order to join the protests happening all across the country in response to the killing of George Floyd, an unarmed black man, by a white police officer. So in the very first sentence, you might be confused by the phrase, got caught in a lie. What does that mean? We know what lies are. Lies are to not tell the truth. And we can guess from the next sentence what this means. So the next sentence said that he told his parents he was going to go for a bike ride, but then he didn't, right? He did go for a bike ride, but he did something much bigger than that. So you might guess that being caught in a lie means that you told a lie and people know that you lied. In the next sentence, you might have a question about the word suburban. And we can break suburban into two parts, sub and urban. You might be familiar with the word urban. Urban means related to a city. And sub means beneath. So suburban means smaller than a big city. So for example, in a big city, people live in tall apartment buildings. In suburban places, they sometimes live in houses or larger condos. In the next sentence, we see the phrase worried sick. So you probably know what worried means, but what does it mean to be worried sick? You can guess that this probably means that you're really worried, so worried that you almost feel sick. In the next sentence, we see the phrase some 6 hours later. And it's not really important, but you see that 6 hours later is there, and some 6 hours later means more or less, not exactly 6 hours later. Could be more, could be less. Finally, in the last sentence, we have the word protests. Protests is a very important word in this reading. And if you don't know what a protest is, it's hard to know what it is just by reading the sentence, unless you've been watching the news and reading the news. So protests, you might think, okay, these are the demonstrations. These are the pictures of people marching together, holding signs and showing that they're angry. And that's exactly what a protest is, when people show that they're unhappy or angry with something that's happening. Okay, and then finally we have the word unarmed. And you know what an arm is, right? An arm is your body part, but an arm has another meaning. Arm also means a weapon, something that is used to hurt something else or someone else. So examples of arms would be guns or knives. So unarmed means you don't have any weapon. You don't have a gun, you don't have a knife. So let's go back. Now we should summarize. If you could use one sentence to summarize this paragraph, what would it be? So remember, when you're summarizing, you want to think about who or what did what and so what. So the who here is my teenage nephew. So you can say the teenage nephew lied to his parents and went to a protest. What do you think you're going to read about in the next paragraph? Let's predict. Maybe we could read more about George Floyd, the person who was killed, or we might read more about the nephew. Here's the second paragraph. So you might want to pause here before we read together. Good for him, I said when my sister-in-law told me what had happened. I think that protest is an important part of society. We protest so that our leaders can see and hear what is important to us. We protest to show that we are unsatisfied with what is happening. We protest to change things. The Black Lives Matter movement that began almost 7 years ago ushered in a number of reforms, as well as a heightened awareness of the deadly impact of racism. But, as we've seen this week, the movement is far from over. People continue to die, and so people continue to protest. So this second paragraph starts with a line of dialogue. Dialogue is when someone is speaking. And in this dialogue, I say, good for him. Good for him means what he did was good. And maybe you don't know what a sister-in-law is. Sister-in-law is the spouse of your sibling. So if your brother or sister marries a woman, that person is your sister-in-law. But your sister-in-law could also be the sister of your spouse. In the second sentence, we see the word protest again. And in the third sentence, another time we see the word protest. And I want you to notice that in the second sentence, when we see protest, it's a different kind of word than the third sentence. We protest. So the first time we see protest here, it is a noun. And the second time we see protest here, it is a verb. So now we can see that protest can be used as a noun and as a verb. And if you don't remember what nouns and verbs are, you can look back at our first grammar lesson from week 1, from class 1. The second word we might not know is unsatisfied. And we can break down unsatisfied into 3 parts. Unsatisfied. Un, of course, means not. Satisfy means to be happy with something. And ed makes this word either a past tense verb or an adjective. And we can see from the sentence, we are unsatisfied, that this is an adjective. Unsatisfied means we're not happy with something. We then see the phrase Black Lives Matter movement. Maybe you've been reading the news and you know what this is, but if you can just guess from the context, we're talking about George Floyd, we're talking about a black man who was killed by a white police officer, we can understand or guess that this has to do with all the protests related to this movement. And hopefully later on, if you have time, you can Google it, look it up on the internet, and see what this is all about. But for the purpose of this paragraph, We just need to know that this is what the protests are about. Ushered in a number of reforms. So let's guess what ushered can mean. If we say this movement ushered in a number of reforms, what verb could you use here that would have something similar to ushered? I would choose the word started. Just started a number of reforms. Reforms, if you can guess what reforms could mean. I would guess that reforms would mean progress or changes. In the next sentence, we see the phrase heightened awareness. And you might look at this first word, heightened, and see the word height. Height means how tall or how high something is. And awareness, being aware of something, knowing that something exists. So you might guess that this has to do with more people being aware of something. Here, deadly impact of racism together means that, being racist, it means thinking badly of other races can kill people. This could have a deadly impact. Okay, so in this paragraph, we've seen a lot of big words probably that we might have never seen before. But we can just guess and have a pretty good idea what this paragraph is all about. So let's pause and summarize the main idea of this paragraph. What are we talking about mostly? One of the words that we see most often in this paragraph is protest. I think protest is the main idea of this paragraph. And here we are protesting. Many people are protesting in the Black Lives Matter movement to show that they're angry, right? This is why people protest. So I would say that to summarize this paragraph, I would just say that these protests are part of the Black Lives Matter movement. So if we want to predict what we will read about in the next paragraph, maybe we will read more about this movement, or maybe we will read about protest in general. We're not sure. So the third paragraph here, maybe you should pause and read out loud to yourself. My sister-in-law, however, was less impressed with his sense of moral and civic duty and more concerned with the fact that her nephew had lied to his parents. I laughed. Don't all teenagers lie to their parents? I certainly lied to my parents all the time when I wanted to do something I knew they wouldn't approve of, and usually it wasn't for something as noble as going to support a critical social movement. Her nephew had caused them a lot of worry when they couldn't get a hold of him. What if something had happened to him? Most protests are peaceful, but, as we've seen this week, protests can quickly get out of control. He could have been hurt, or worse. So a lot of vocabulary in this paragraph as well. We first see the words moral and civic duty. You might say, wait, this looks a lot like the word civil, and you would be right, so these words are related. And moral you might know as having to do with ethics, what is right, what is wrong. We've got kind of a comparison here in this first sentence. We see less impressed with moral and civic duty and more concerned with the nephew lying to the parents. So these are kind of opposites. And you can guess that being less impressed means you're not that happy with this idea of moral and civic duty, and more concerned, more worried with the lying. So these things are being compared. Next, we have a question. Don't all teenagers lie to their parents? What is this question doing here? Who is this question directed at? Why are we asking this question? This question is just meant to show what the speaker is thinking. Oh, that lying isn't a big deal, really, because all teenagers lie to their parents. So this question is really more like a sentence. All teenagers lie to their parents. I certainly lied. So certainly, we have an adverb here that means really, I really lied to them. It means yes, indeed, I did. This sentence is kind of complicated. The speaker is saying that she lied to her parents, and it wasn't for something as noble as what the nephew did, which was supporting a critical social movement. So you can guess that she probably lied for things that weren't as good as what the nephew lied about. So noble is something that is good, and supporting a critical social movement is participating in this social movement. And it's hard to guess what critical means here. What could critical mean? It could mean important, it could mean dangerous, It could be provocative, something that people are arguing about. We're not really sure. So critical, this would be a good chance or a good place to use your dictionary. But it's not that important of a word right now. You just know that they're talking about the same social movement that the nephew was in. Next, we have the phrase get a hold of. And you can probably guess what this means. Maybe his parents couldn't get a hold of him. That means they couldn't reach him. Right? A hold, you might think hold is touching them. So they couldn't get in contact with him. They couldn't call him. They couldn't talk to him. And protests can get out of control. So in this sentence, we again see a comparison. Most protests are peaceful, but protests can quickly get out of control. So we can guess that out of control is the opposite of peaceful because of the word but in the middle, right? But means we're going to see a contrast. So out of control, yes, is kind of the opposite of peaceful here. Something is going badly. Okay, so that's a lot of vocabulary, a lot of things we had to think about in this paragraph. But let's try to summarize. What is the main idea of this third paragraph? So it's hard to tell. So are we talking about all teenagers? Are we talking about the nephew? Are we talking about the speaker? But we can think about the first sentence that kind of sets up what this paragraph is going to talk about. And it's that idea, that comparison of moral and civic duty versus lying. So what's more important here? Following your moral and civic duty or telling the truth to your parents? So maybe a good summary for this paragraph would be the nephew tried to be morally and civically responsible, but he lied to his parents, which was bad. So he did a good thing by going to the protest, but he did a bad thing by lying to his parents. That seems to be the main idea of this paragraph. And let's predict what we'll read about in the next paragraph. Maybe we're going to read about the last sentence. The last sentence tells us that things could have been bad. He could have been hurt. So what would happen if he had been hurt? You might pause here to read aloud to yourself. My younger brother wanted to know what his punishment had been. The usual punishment, grounding, seems ineffective. Most of us are still grounded because of the pandemic. Instead, his parents had taken away his Wi-Fi privileges for 2 weeks. That seems extreme, he said. Yeah, they should be proud of him, I said. But he lied to his parents, my sister-in-law reminded me. All right, so I just picked out 3 words here. Punishment, right? Because punishment is a word that is repeated twice. It's important to know what it means. And we said in the last lesson that punishment is the bad thing that happens to you when you do something bad. So punishment, if you're a criminal, you might go to jail. That would be a punishment. So grounding is not obvious here. Grounding seems ineffective because of the pandemic. But grounding is what many American parents do. It's when they don't allow their kids to go out. So they can't go to see their friends. They can't go to parties. They can't go hang out with their friends. But in this situation, grounding is ineffective. Ineffective means it doesn't work. Because most of us are still grounded. We can't go out because of the pandemic. And I drew out the word privileges too, because privileges was in our first lesson. I think in that lesson, we were talking about teaching English. And I said that it is a privilege to share my love of languages with so many people. And you can remember, what does privilege mean? It means something special. So Wi-Fi privileges means you're allowed to use Wi-Fi, which is something you're allowed to do, something special. It's not a guaranteed right. All right, so this paragraph is a little shorter. If we can summarize, here it's a little bit easier. We're talking about punishments and privileges, and the dialogue at the end shows that there are different opinions about his punishment. So we can just say the nephew was punished, and there is some disagreement. These siblings are disagreeing about whether the punishment was appropriate, whether it was good. Let's predict what we read in the next paragraph now. We'll probably read more about this idea of whether the punishment is good because we haven't decided if this is a good punishment. Okay, I conceded. But I hope that his parents told him that although they were proud of him for standing with the protesters, he had to be punished for lying to them to join a potentially dangerous situation far away from home. That's a really short paragraph, but that's okay. And it's one long sentence. The first word that you might not know is conceited. But you can see that conceited is a verb and it's not in the dialogue, right? So you can just say that conceited is something like said, I said. And we don't really need to know exactly what conceited means. And then we have the word potentially. So potentially is an adverb. And do we need to know what potentially means to understand the sentence? If we take out the word potentially, he had to be punished for lying to them to join a dangerous situation far away from home. Yeah, it's not really the same. So were the protests dangerous? Not most of them. So potentially we can guess means maybe, to join a maybe dangerous situation far away from home, because that didn't end up being dangerous. So to summarize this paragraph, we can say that the speaker thinks that his parents should be proud, but he still needs to be punished. And now let's predict what we're going to read in the next paragraph. We'll probably read more about this punishment of the nephews. This is the last paragraph. My older brother spoke up. It's good that he was punished. It's like being arrested at a protest. We all agreed that perhaps this was the best real-life introduction to civil disobedience. While it's important to protest and stand up for what you believe is right, it's equally important to understand that all actions, even good ones, have consequences. In the first sentence, we see the phrase spoke up. And spoke is the past tense of speak. But why is the up there? We might not be sure about that, but it's not that important for now. Just think of it as said. Also, my older brother said, it's good that he was punished. It's like being arrested. And if you've been reading the news, you probably know what arrested means. That means the police stop you and maybe take you to jail. And in the next paragraph, which is the last paragraph, we have the phrase civil disobedience. And we already talked about what civil disobedience means. Can you remember? Right? It means not following the law in an orderly way, which is kind of what protesting is. And this is the name of this piece. So we can see that when we see the title of the story, it's probably an important part, an important sentence. While it's important to protest and stand up for what you believe is right, what is stand up for? This is another verb that's similar to the first verb of this page, spoke up. These are called phrasal verbs. We'll do a grammar lesson on this later. But what does this mean, stand up for what you believe is right? What verb could we put here that would make sense to us? Well, we talked about the word support earlier, and I would say that stand up for is similar to support what you believe is right. Then the last word in this story is consequences. We could guess that consequences is a noun, is something that happens to you. And it could be similar to another word that we learned in this reading, and that word would be punishment. Okay, so now let's summarize this last paragraph. If you could choose one sentence, so now let's summarize this last page. If you could choose one sentence as a summary, as a main idea, which one would you choose? I would probably choose the very last sentence. And this is pretty common, that the last sentence of the story can give you the main idea and tell you what's the most important part. So thanks for staying with this lesson. Today's lesson was pretty hard, but to review, you can summarize what you've read. Imagine you're telling a friend about the story you read today. What would you tell them it's about in 1 or 2 sentences? Go back and review any parts that you're still confused about. You can use a dictionary like Merriam-Webster.com. Add any new words you've learned to your personal dictionary that you might be keeping. And please continue on with this week's writing and speaking lessons, where we will talk more about the vocabulary and how to use it correctly when writing, and then practice speaking with these words and ideas. Thanks a lot.